briefly about right sharing because I don't have any intention of speaking too much specifically to what we do for the next little bit of time together. But please, I'd love to chat with you over a meal if you're interested in learning more, or as Tom mentioned, there are a number of board members present. So about 10 years ago or so, I was living in a tiny studio apartment in Washington, D.C. That's good to know. I'm glad to know the audio works. That's great. That's great. So I was living in this tiny studio apartment. I was honestly probably spending about 70% of my income at the time on this tiny apartment. But because I grew up, I think because I grew up just outside of Wilmington, Ohio, in a place very similar to where we are now, I was really excited to live in the city. I was really excited to live in a place where I could walk everywhere and where I was surrounded by people and by movement and what felt like potential. And every morning on my walk to the metro, the Columbia Heights Metro, I encountered the same 2 or 3 men who I assumed were unhoused on the sidewalk in just the 2 to 3 block walk. And we kind of started a bit of a tradition every morning. I would say good morning to them, and they would say good morning to me. It was nothing that felt too significant. I think just a simple acknowledgement of one another's humanity. And then maybe after a year or so of doing this, I turned the corner one day, and one of the men there was having a medical emergency. And I would like to tell you that I stopped and I helped him. Maybe after a year or so of doing this, I turned the corner one day, and one of the men there was having a medical. I stopped and I helped him. Maybe after a year or so of doing this, I turned the corner one day, and one of the men there was having a medical, and I helped him. Maybe after a year or so of doing this, I turned the corner one day. It's taken me a long time to get there. It was not that I lacked compassion, but that I was distracted. I was distracted by my schedule. I was distracted by this pressure to keep moving. I was distracted by the pace of life and living in the big city. I'd become disconnected from myself, disconnected from the people around me. And I think most importantly, I had become disconnected from God. At Right Sharing, we have been doing staff book clubs. And we recently read a book called Hospicing Modernity. And this book is about the kind of current structures of the world and how we might go about reimagining them in a way that supports humanity and supports the health of the planet. And she talks about these patterns of behavior that are destroying the earth, and the root, one of the root causes of us participating in this is the illusion of separation. And we finished this book a couple of months ago, but I keep hearing this phrase in my mind, the illusion of separation. Because, separation isn't just a social problem, but it's a spiritual problem. It's something that I think about when I think about that man on the sidewalk 10 years ago. And I've come to believe that simplicity is a way that friends might be able to answer this illusion of separation. I think too often we think that simplicity means having less. And this is something that I've really struggled with since becoming a friend. It often seems like a race to have the least. But I wonder if simplicity is more about removing the things that are keeping us from our relationships. The things that are keeping us from our relationships with God, the things that are keeping us from our relationships with one another, with creation, with what we're being called to do, our ability to hear what we're being called to do. And that perhaps simplicity isn't about deprivation. It isn't about this need to have less, but perhaps simplicity is about connection. Perhaps simplicity isn't about becoming smaller, but becoming whole. And I really think that early Friends understood this. When George Fox criticized extravagance and excessive consumption, he was not simply worried about fashions of the day. He was concerned with what consumption was doing to people and to the planet. In his 1657 letter called The Priest's Fruits Made Manifest and the Fashions of the World, Fox warned against those who were, in his words, the spoilers of creation, stating in reference to the wearing of current fashions, "Doth not these cumber God's earth?" The problem was not the ribbons. The problem was a way of living that severed relationship with creation itself. I think William Penn expressed a similar concern when he wrote, "Some are so taken with themselves, it would seem that nothing else deserved their attention. But what aggravates the evil is that the pride of one might comfortably supply the needs of 10. Penn's concern was not around beauty and fashion. His concern was around excess amid suffering. His concern was what happens when our attention turns inward and we lose sight of our responsibilities to one another, like I did that day on the sidewalk. Even among the earliest Friends, there was recognition that simplicity could become distorted. Margaret Fell wrote this: "It's a dangerous thing to lead young friends much into the observation of outward things, which may be easily done. For they can soon get into an outward garb, to be all alike outwardly. But this will not make them into true Christians. It's the Spirit that gives life." It's a powerful reminder. It's a reminder that we can dress in plain clothing and still be consumed with pride. It's a reminder that a person can own very little and still be spiritually distracted. That we can spend all of our time decluttering our homes and still not declutter our hearts. The goal of simplicity is not simplicity for simplicity's sake. The goal is faithfulness. The goal is to become available to God. And I think this understanding appears again and again throughout Quaker history. Thomas Kelly observed, "We are trying to be several selves at once, without all ourselves being organized by a single mastering life within us." I know I relate to that very fully, trying to be several selves all at once. Perhaps you all can relate a little bit as well. We're trying to be daughters and sisters and workers, parents, activists, volunteers. We're consumers. We're so many things. We're pulled in hundreds of directions. And often we mistake busyness for faithfulness. But Thomas Kelly reminds us that the spiritual life is not about doing more. It's about being centered. This is what Quaker writer Francis Tabor describes beautifully in Finding the Taproot of Simplicity. And I just will emphasize that if you have not read Finding the Taproot of Simplicity, I highly encourage it. She writes, "It may surprise some of us to hear that the first generation of Friends did not have a testimony for simplicity. They came upon a faith which cut to the root of the way they saw life. They saw that all they did must flow directly from what they experienced as true, and that if it did not, both the knowing and the doing became false. In order to keep the knowledge clear and the doing true, they stripped away anything which seemed to get in the way. The outward practices of simplicity are not the root. The root is the inward alignment. The root is faithfulness. The root is learning to hear God's voice clearly enough that all the unnecessary noises begin to fall away." John Woolman understood this deeply when he wrote, "In the love of money and in the wisdom of this world, business is proposed. Then the urgency of affairs pushed forward, and the mind cannot, in this state, discern the good and perfect will of God. The urgency of affairs pushes forward. I feel like I experience that every single day. Perhaps it's a very apt description of modern life. I was just recently in a conversation with a colleague. We were trying to determine what's a reasonable amount of time to expect for someone to respond to an email, And I felt like it was anywhere from like 10 minutes to 2 hours, but it wasn't a day, it wasn't 2 days, right? And some of the emails that we're sending are not that urgent. So we have this sense that everything feels urgent, whether it's an email or a notification, some type of obligation we might have, a news alert. There's always something there. And yet, Woolman suggests that urgency itself can become an obstacle to discernment. When everything is urgent, nothing is sacred. When everything demands our attention, we lose the ability to hear God's invitation. This leads me to what I think are kind of the 5 dimensions of simplicity for a modern time. The first is the simplicity of attention. Do we create space for silence? I know this is something I struggle with. I've always got a podcast on. I'm always listening to the radio. Do we allow ourselves moments of stillness? Do we notice the people around us? Can we hear the inner truth beneath all the noise? The second is the simplicity of possession. And this is where I think I really struggled and for a long time felt that that's all simplicity was about, was what we owned and what we possessed. And I think I've come to learn that possessions aren't inherently bad, but that everything we own requires our energy. Everything we own requires our time and attention, right? So the question is not, how can I own a little? But the question is, what helps me live faithfully? And what distracts me from the life that God is calling me toward? The third is the simplicity of schedules. Okay, I also struggle with this one. I just keep saying it for all 5. This is another one I struggle with. So many of us are exhausted. I know I can be exhausted a lot of the time. And it's perhaps not because we have too much to do, but because we've forgotten how to distinguish between what is essential and what is merely urgent. Simplicity asks, what is mine to do and what can I release? What is mine to do and what can I release? I have a really hard time letting go of things sometimes. And the fourth is simplicity of relationships. Our world encourages us to reduce people down to labels, political labels, economic labels, social categories. Yet simplicity asks us to encounter people as human beings, to recognize that of God in every person that we encounter. Even those we fear, even those we would rather avoid, I would say especially those we disagree with. And the fifth is a simplicity of purpose. What is the organizing center of our lives? What remains when all of the labels fall away? Who is God calling us to become? As I've reflected on simplicity over the years, I've really wrestled with it. If I'm going to be completely honest with you, I'm speaking to you today about simplicity because I was the last to respond in the email thread. I feel like I don't have kids, but I feel like I'd be saying that simplicity was my least favorite child, And I think that's because I struggle with it the most. I grew up with relatively less in the United States than others, from a blue-collar background. My father is a garbage man, right? And I took that experience with me to Guilford College. And Guilford was the first place where I really deeply explored Quaker testimonies. And I did so mostly with my cohort of folks from the Quaker Leaders Scholar Program. And I learned as I was getting to know them that I assumed, and it's still an assumption, many of them had different experiences than me when it came to resources that they grew up with and what was regularly available to them. So when we started talking about simplicity, there was a quiet resentment that kind of grew in me. It felt like folks who had abundance were telling other people like myself that had fewer resources that holiness required me to want less. And that really didn't seem fair to me. It didn't really feel holy. And I struggled with it because I don't think that scarcity is necessarily holy, and I don't think that scarcity is God's dream for humanity. And the testimony of simplicity cannot be an invitation to romanticize hardship. I want to say that again. The testimony of simplicity cannot be an invitation to romanticize hardship. This is also something I've struggled with when I started working at Right Sharing of World Resources. We work with women's groups around the world who do amazing things to support themselves and their communities with very, very little. And I think it can be easy to romanticize that hardship in the process of learning their stories. But this is why I've been so grateful to Kenyan friend John Muhanji, who I think many of you are familiar with. He recently published a book, Rooted and Reimagined, A Quaker Theology in African Soil. And while he was finishing writing that book at Pendle Hill, myself and Right Sharing's executive director had lunch with him. And we really wanted to talk with him about simplicity in the African context. And he talked a lot about how simplicity in an African context cannot be lived out in the same way that it is in the West. He writes, and I will just say that I haven't read the book yet. He wrote us a little segment that he was going to include in the book, so I don't know if it's there, but I know he wrote this. He writes, in Africa, colonial legacies, systemic poverty, and ongoing economic injustice impose simplicity on many people, leaving them with little choice in the matter. African families do not practice minimalism as a spiritual discipline. They navigate daily acts of resilience, survival, and care for their communities. In this light, simplicity must move beyond a call to consume less and evolve into a practice of faithful stewardship, communal solidarity, and restorative justice. That observation changed how I think about simplicity. John reminds us that many communities around the world are not choosing simplicity. They're navigating systems that are shaped by colonialism, extraction, and inequality. For them, simplicity is not minimalism. It's stewardship. It's mutual care. It's community. He writes, simplicity in Africa is not about having less. It is about using what one has to build a more just and interconnected world. I find that vision deeply hopeful because it shifts the focus away from possessions and toward relationships. The opposite of consumerism is not poverty. The opposite of consumerism is relationships. It's community. The opposite of consumerism is remembering that our lives are intertwined. This truth is something that I've witnessed throughout my work with Right Sharing. I see this truth in the story of Bintu, who we have a picture, I believe, of Bintu. So Bintu is a woman that my colleagues met in the eastern province of Sierra Leone in February of this year. She's a member of the Mulgaloma Women's Group. She joined that group 2 years ago now, I believe, was part of what she said. When my colleagues met her, she told her story, and she talked a little bit about how years ago, her and her husband had a very successful business. She was caring for her children and sending them to school. And then her husband left, and he took the business with him and left the children. And her situation became so dire that eventually her 2 oldest children left her. She has not seen them since. She was unable to care for them, so they went to see if they could care for themselves. Bintu joined this women's group, received some business training, and then received a loan from her women's group. And through that process, she created a very successful bread distribution business. And she didn't stop there. When she was able to care for her children, she started mentoring 10 women in a nearby village, women who don't have access to the loans that she does because she's part of this women's group. But she's taken every piece of the training that she's had and passed it on to the women in this group. And it's her hope that in the next year or two, and we're really expecting to see this, that she's going to formally form a new women's group and apply for a grant so that they're able to also access the loans to build their businesses. I think that that story and others like it really help to demonstrate that abundance is not measured in accumulation and in possessions, but that abundance is measured by connection. Abundance is measured by mutual care and by a respect for one another's dignity. This also reminds me of a writer, Charles Einstein, who wrote Sacred Economics. In Sacred Economics, he writes, "The converging crises of our time all arise from a common root that we might call separation," similar to the illusion of separation I talked about earlier. So climate change, loneliness, economic inequality, political polarization, all very different symptoms, but all perhaps the same root, separation. And if separation is the disease, then I think simplicity might be part of the healing. Not because simplicity solves every problem, not because simplicity reconnects us to what is real. But because simplicity reconnects us to what is real, to God, to one another, to creation, to our own sacred callings. Friends, I don't believe that simplicity is something for comfortable times. We're living in seasons right now that are marked with anxiety and division and despair. Many people, myself included, feel overwhelmed. Many people feel powerless and disconnected. And I think simplicity offers another way. Simplicity reminds us that we do not need to save the world through frantic activity. I'm going to read that again for myself. Simplicity reminds us that we do not need to save the world through frantic activity. We begin by listening. We begin by noticing. We begin by making room for God. We begin by restoring relationships. John Woolman once wrote, "Oh, how safe, how quiet is it, that state where the soul stands in pure obedience to the voice of Christ." What if simplicity is not about sacrifice at all? What if simplicity is about finding that quiet place? What if simplicity is about clearing away everything that prevents us from hearing the voice of God? What if simplicity is about being fully available to love? The day I walked past that man on the sidewalk, I was living in the illusion of separation. I had forgotten that his life and mine were connected. I had forgotten that God was already there present on the sidewalk. The testimony of simplicity calls us back to that. It calls us back to attention. It calls us back to our relationships, to being present, back to love. Not because having less is the goal, but because connection is. Not because simplicity is an end in itself, but because simplicity helps us hear the voice that has been calling us home all along. I'd like to leave you all with a few queries to consider as we go into worship. What distractions, possessions, habits, or expectations are keeping me from hearing God's voice more clearly? Where in my life have I accepted the illusion of separation, and how might God be inviting me back into relationship? How can I use the gifts, resources, and abundance entrusted to me to help build a more just, connected, and loving world? Friends, may we live simply enough to hear God clearly, love others deeply, and recognize that we are never separate from one another.